Here's a lesson on Spanish subjunctive. It's designed to be sort of introduction to the subjunctive, particularly for those of us that come from an English-speaking background, perhaps didn't have the luxury of being exposed to the language from an early age. So we have to take a slightly more academic approach. I use plenty of examples in our target language, but I'll leave it to you to translate the examples if you find that necessary. We'll start with a quick quiz just as a warm-up to test what you already know. It's very straightforward, no surprises. And then I'll share a story about some of the issues I had early on with Spanish verb conjugation. And then we learn how the subjunctive is formed and finally how to actually use it. Okay, here we go. Espero que tú, tener un buen día, tengas, muy bien. Quiero que tú me llamar mañana. Llames. Cuando yo ser mayor, seré astronauta. Sea. Espero que ellos venir a la fiesta. Vengan. Temo que algo malo le haber pasado. Haya. Si yo haber sabido esto, no lo habría hecho. Hubiera. Si yo tener dinero bastante, viajaría más. Tuviera. So, what do we notice from that exercise? Well, most likely, if you were a native speaker, you probably know just intuitively which form is correct without having to think about it. But for the language learner, what you might have done was first identify the indicative form of the verb, and then later conclude that the other option must have been the subjunctive. What that means is to really capture the essence of the subjunctive mood, it helps to already have a solid grasp of the indicative mood. And we'll see what I mean by that as we go on. So imagine me as a first-year Spanish student. Here's what I know. I know how to conjugate verbs in the present tense, and that all the conjugations have similar endings. So, for example, hablar, hablo, hablas, habla, hablamos, habláis, hablan. Then imagine I hear our professor gives various commands to the class. So when she addresses one person in singular, she would say something like, siéntate, levántate, escucha. Or if she was addressing the class as a whole, she would say, siéntense, levántense, escuchen. Okay, so what do we notice here? The to form ends with an A, and the ustedes form ends in an E, or EN. So the question I'm asking is, why do we have different vowel endings for commands when we see above that hablar, for example, always ends always has an A in the ending. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but this was my predicament, essentially. Imagine me trying to infer the rules of verbs, not knowing anything about commands or various tenses or moods. So what I want to do is let me go ahead and use the imperative mood as an example to help derive the meaning of the subjunctive in Spanish. So again, should be review, but first bullet, we have to habla. So you're essentially dropping the S from the normal present tense conjugation. For usted, it would be hable. So we notice the vowel switch from A to E. And the reason why is really just because. So hence the confusion, you can see my confusion with respect to vowel endings. The verb needs to sound different when you hear it compared to indicative. That's what makes it a mood. And until you've had enough exposure to regular plain indicative, then you'll probably be stuck getting confused like I was about the correct vowel endings. Of course, this was partly due to the fact that our teacher addressed the class in the ustedes form, which we can see undergoes this vowel flip, just like with usted. So other examples of basic commands would be dime, dígame, pon, ponga, vete, váyase, and notice in the negative, no te vayas, just has a different form. So what do I mean when I say the imperative and the subjunctive share a similar linguistic quality? Well, if imperative is a way to give orders or commands, then subjunctive is really just the same way of expressing that same desire, but perhaps with a nicer and more complete sentence. So if niña canta is a command, then in the subjunctive, we could say something like, queremos que ella cante. So that's sort of the long way around to arrive at the subjunctive by taking a slight detour through the imperative. But I do this because I think it helps to make these sort of connections and build an overall deeper understanding. So now let us look at how the subjunctive is formed structurally. I thought it might be helpful to present this part visually. So here we see the common verb tenses on a timeline, and it's not perfect and it's not complete. There's, tenses that I haven't shown here, but you get the idea. So first question, why don't we see the subjunctive on this timeline? Well, the answer, of course, is because subjunctive is not a tense, rather it's a mood. So to form the subjunctive, we need only to focus on these two tenses in particular right now. That is present tense and the simple preterite or simple past. So take the verb querer. The subjunctive in the present borrows the same structure from the yo form in indicative, only then we do the vowel switch, in this case from E to A, because querer ends in ER. Similarly, the subjunctive in the past inherits the same structure as the third person plural of simple preterite. I know that's a mouthful. So, ellos quisieron becomes quisiera. Querer is irregular in the simple preterite, right? Quise, quisiste has an irregular root. And this visual helps demonstrate that. In fact, a lot of common verbs have irregular forms that you just need to memorize. And those irregular roots is probably the only hard part about Spanish verbs, because once you have the root, then the actual conjugation is relatively easy. But here's a little bit of a shortcut to deriving the subjunctive, assuming you know the conjugations in indicative. Another example would be poner. So pongo becomes ponga, pusieron gives us pusiera. And just for completion, we can bring back the imperative mood, since we just covered that at the same time. And here we see all three moods in parallel. And when you put it this way, it doesn't seem all that scary. There are really only two cases in the subjunctive that we need to worry about, either the present or the past. For the most part, we don't worry about a future subjunctive as its own tense, although it does exist, but it's rarely used. However, there is one final wrinkle that I want to touch on in this regard, and that's this. So, what we're looking at here is imperfecto de subjuntivo, or subjunctive in the past. We actually have two options for what to use. The first option tends to be more common, but both are perfectly valid, and you want to know both forms because you'll inevitably come across them. The two are largely interchangeable as long as they're used strictly in the subjunctive, which is what we're talking about. Which form to use is really a matter of preference, style, or sometimes regional or geographic differences. So the big question, why do we have two forms? The difference is really only historical. And interestingly, the form cantara is actually an antiquated tense originally belonging to the indicative mood, which has since merged with the second form, cantase, to essentially mean the same thing. But that's more than we need to know right now. You can look up more details about the history of these two. And usually by this point, students are feeling quite overwhelmed. But I'll tell you, I've learned to appreciate the richness of Spanish verbs because it's all very organized and methodical and adds texture to the language, which ultimately allows you to say more precise things with fewer words. So almost done, but of course, last thing is finally the part that we really care about is how to use it, when to use it. So if you're just learning subjunctive, you might hear something like the following. Subjunctive is used for desires, wishes, doubts, emotions, advice. One interesting way to put it, I heard someone say virtual information. and of course everyone's favorite, ojalá. But my advice would be, don't try to use some sort of mnemonic to recall when exactly to use subjunctive, because in reality, the number of examples is virtually limitless, and any verb can take on the subjunctive mood, depending on the context, as far as I know. But we can broadly think of it in terms of cases where subjunctive is required by the grammar, and then cases where it's slightly more flexible or ambiguous. For example, first bullet. Espero que estés bien. Dudo que te lo hayan dado. Es raro que ella no me llame. Es normal que la cosa suceda así. Necesito que me ayudes. Dile a tu marido que saque la basura. Te doy mi chaqueta para que no tengas frío. And I can go on like this, right? I just pull these examples off the top of my head. So you should be able to spot a pattern. Notice, crucially, the use of the word que as a way of linking the main clause and the dependent clause with two different people or objects on each side of the sentence. In the first part, I'm expressing a feeling or an opinion about the statement in the second part without making a claim as to whether the statement in the second half is true or not. In English, we usually accomplish this mood explicitly by using words like hypothetically, and thereby convey a certain mood. The fact that we're speaking hypothetically. In fact, there are cases where we use the subjunctive in English, but it tends to be limited by an overall less expressive verb conjugations. But for example, in English, we would say, if I were you, right? And that's the verb changes because normally you say I was, if I was. But subjunctive would be if I were you. Or another thing you could say in English is, I would like that he go along. So the verb go changes here because normally you would say he goes. Anyway, the next point down would be counterfactual. So, si yo fuera tú, or si supiera, or si yo fuera consciente de eso, no lo habría hecho. Notice that's a different way of saying the same thing from one of the early examples way back in the quiz. Then another example would be future conjecture. Cuando nos veamos, hablaremos. En cuanto llegue a la oficina, ya te diré. So, subjunctive because we're making some conjecture as to what is going to happen in the future. Check out this page by Lawless Spanish for more examples that really demonstrate the wide variety of cases of the subjunctive. Again, it's the underlying pattern, the grammatical pattern, or the triggers that's more important than trying to memorize all the possible scenarios. Now, there's a number of instances where the subjunctive is strictly not to be used, such as verbs of thinking, knowing. or verbs of the physical senses. So we say things like creo que, pienso que, veo que. These would all be used with indicative normally. However, there's an important exception to these whenever we're speaking in the negative. So you would say, no creo que vaya a pasar. No creo que eso vaya a pasar. And it's here that the use of the subjunctive becomes clear, because the speaker is literally saying, I don't believe that such and such is the case. Therefore, the verb in question takes on the subjunctive. In the case of an if-then conditional type statement, si pasa esto, entonces pasaría lo otro. In these cases, you generally expect to see the verb in indicative following the if, that is the word si. So therefore, not subjunctive. But don't confuse this with the more specific case of the counterfactual statement like we saw above. So this could be potentially confusing, but I would say rule of thumb, if it's an if-then type statement, use indicative, unless, of course, you're stating a hypothetical or counterfactual where it's implied that the statement is counterfactual. In many cases, use of the subjunctive mood is entirely optional, which is why it's important to ask, what is the speaker's intent? Does the speaker believe the truth of the statement? Or does he or she intend to convey a sense of uncertainty or ambiguity? For example, let's look at this final example. Me voy a la fiesta aunque no funciona el coche. Or the second one, me voy a la fiesta aunque no funcione el coche. So hopefully you can spot the difference. It's literally one letter. Both sentences are perfectly grammatically correct. So what is the difference? The difference is the mood, or the connotation we want to convey. In the first one, the verb funciona is an indicative, and so what we're saying is, I'll go to the party even though the car doesn't work. So we're stating that the car does not work, but I'll go to the party anyway. In the second example, the verb funcione is in subjunctive. So here the connotation would be, I'll go to the party even if the car doesn't work. Regardless of whether the car works or not, I'll go to the party. So here we see subjunctive is entirely optional, but whether to use it depends on the meaning we want to convey. So it's really up to you as the speaker to choose what's the appropriate connotation. This is why subjunctive, so confusing for students, tends to be a thorn in our sides, because we want to have something to memorize, but in fact it is it's not always so black and white. Some of the pitfalls I see students will either miss or ignore the subjunctive trigger that's implied or required by the grammar or sentence structure. So missing the dependent clause or some of the examples from above. The other pitfall would be students tend to take it too far. They say, well, I don't know if such and such happened or not, so therefore subjunctive. And they say everything's subjunctive because I don't know whether it happened or not. But again, that's ignoring some of the some of the specific structures. I would say don't overthink it. At the end of the day, what's correct is what people actually use in daily speech, what native speakers use, and not always what might seem the most logical. So don't overthink it. And if you overthink it, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you look for a logical reason or explanation for a rule, and you don't always find it, or it might seem counterintuitive. But I would say what's correct is what people actually use. The last website here, more examples, is a page from thoughtco.com. That was actually a good article that shows more examples that would help illustrate how subjunctive is used. So definitely check that out too. Check out both of these websites that I have linked. My advice, as always, was listen for the patterns and repeat the patterns. If at any point you feel as though you're starting to invent your own version of the language, stop, slow down, try to simplify the sentence, focus on standard grammatical structures, which structures you want to employ, build complex sentences out of simpler parts. Of course, I'm not an expert here. I continue to learn new things all the time. Surely there's more examples that I haven't thought of here. So do let me know if you feel I missed something that should have been included on the slides. And who knows, maybe we can do a part 2 in the future about more fun facts about Spanish subjunctive. Okay, that's it.